Okay, thank you. So with this, I'm going to introduce Andy McIntosh. Andy arrived here on, Andy and his wife Juliet arrived here on Wednesday, and he's already spoken at the Calvary Chapel in Lake Stevens. Got off the plane at 3:30 or so. We picked him up, quick lunch or quick dinner, and no, supper, I guess it's called yeah. But we got him to the meeting in time, and so we had a great time there. It's a very huge audience and a lot of interest in what he had to say. This morning I brought him to two different Christian schools, and he talked about the bombardier beetle. I think many of you have heard of the magic of that beetle before, and he's actually going to be speaking about that at youth night on Saturday night. But this evening he's going to speak on the intricacies of flight and look at the aerodynamics of birds, in particular look at others who are very special, have been specially designed for flight. And he's going to look at a few examples and explain to us what that all means. Andy has been a professor at Leeds University in the UK for more than 30 years, I believe. And actually, a lot of his bombardier beetle research was also done at that university. And for the last, I guess, 10 or 15 years, he's been speaking on creation topics as a scientist and explaining that science is consistent with the Bible. So with that, Andy, come on up.
Here we go. See the light? I saw the light some years ago. Very good. Well, it was on before. I don't understand that. There we go. All right. So a few things I just want to mention on the books and the resources. I've brought over some DVDs, which I'm just going to mention to you, and I will mention the books as well. The DVD of the talk tonight is there. It was done at Maranatha Church in San Diego some years ago. So it'll be essentially what I'm doing tonight, so you're welcome to pick that up. They are, I think, what are we selling for? $5, I think. Yeah, Juliet says $5. There's a talk which I'm doing tomorrow at the forum meetings, at whenever it is tomorrow. It's in the morning. No, Saturday, that's right, tomorrow morning. This is the talk on insect flight, which I'm going to be doing tomorrow. David Reeves has produced that quite nicely. And some other DVDs, there's a whole range of them. There's about 15 DVDs there. This is The Wonder of Hearing, which I don't think I'm doing in this area, but you're welcome to get hold of that. There's a debate I did some years ago on flight, where you got an evolutionist, sadly he's died now, William Provine, and I was debating him on flight. So you get both sides of the argument if you want to use that evangelistically, and that person whom you're going to give it to can decide which he thinks is more to the point and more logical. Then there's a talk I've got here on atheism. There's also a smaller version. If you want just the DVD on its own, it'll be $5. I forget now what we've made this. I think it's $8 for if you want the box as well. But that's a talk I did a couple of years ago in South Africa, but it's essentially the arguments that I use when I debate atheists. And with that in mind, there is a booklet which is simply called Are You Really an Atheist? That's 50 cents if you want to pick up a few copies of that to give out to people who are atheists. It logically presents that atheism makes no sense of reality, and it makes no sense of the science, makes no sense of where your mind comes from, which is probably the most important point before you get to the spiritual areas. And then it makes no sense of meaning and truth. And then finally, it makes no sense of morality, and it leads into the gospel. So it's really a gospel leaflet, but deliberately for an atheist, somebody who's really intent on saying that you can't be a Christian and do science and that sort of line, which is increasingly becoming the case here in the United States. And it's become very much the case in England, but it's increasing here. You need to be aware, and I'm sure you are aware, that in academia particularly, the universities are very anti-Christian now, most of them. This is an evangelistic booklet, which is a summary of a much bigger book which I would encourage you to get. It's on the bookstore. And there's a whole area here in this big book, which is $38, I think, $38. So it's expensive because it's got lots and lots of pictures, and it's produced beautifully by a brilliant graphics designer in England. And you can see it's got a lot on flights, which is the area that I'm talking on tonight. So it's got all sorts of pictures and interesting information. It's not just the pictures, is a lot of information is in here as well, which I think you will perhaps enjoy. So this is not your copy. This is already going to, come and get it, Emil. This is my good friend from Bulgaria, wonderful gentleman. I've spoken in his church, in his group, Campus Crusade. You need to pray for this guy. He's doing a great work in Varna and Sofia and other places in Bulgaria. So there we go. Do pray for Emil. That's his copy, which I'm giving him. And a summary of that, as I said, is in here, but it's more evangelistic. It's not meant to be for Christians. It's more for giving to people who want, to know a few arguments which you've shared. Then my other book, Genesis 1 to 11, which came out about 2 or 3 years ago. This is a verse-by-verse commentary, which you can get hold of. I forget now how much. Oh, that's $8. And this is $14. This is Genesis for Today, in its 6th edition. God has chosen to bless this. Oh, this is the 5th edition, but it's not much different to the 6th. It's just a few corrections, which I keep on finding. But in the main, it's the same. And this God has used over about 20 years since it was first produced. So I think that's all to say. Feel free to browse the bookstore. Thank you very much, Julia. And I just want to now just share with you the importance of how you can use this argument about flight. I really get excited about flight because I've always loved flight. I've thoroughly enjoyed looking at airplanes, going to airports. Juliet got completely bored when I, dragged her around a few airports initially. But then, we both appreciated the arguments from nature, but I particularly appreciate the argument from bird flight. I'm going to be talking about insect flight tomorrow, so both aspects of flight really show the remarkable wonder of what God has done in making birds. You may not, some of you, be entirely convinced, but to be frank, to me, it's very evident, and I want you to see that just from the science of aerodynamics, you cannot produce a sophisticated flying machine when you've got so many things which are having to work together. We call that irreducible complexity. And I'd like to ask people, is it evolutionary magic or is it brilliant engineering? Because engineering, if you do any engineering, and some of you have done or are doing, you cannot make things work unless you've understood the principles behind what you're trying to make work. And an engineer often is building something which has never been done before, unlike many of the other branches of science where you're just simply observing what's there in the biology laboratory or in the zoology and other important observational sciences. Engineers are seeking to build something which wasn't there before. And that's what the Wright brothers were doing. Here's an example, of course, of one of your favorites, if you like aviation, the Blue Angels just doing their marvelous stunts. You know, that took a huge amount of effort to get to the point that we have today of supersonic fighters, which cannot operate without carefully designed wings and control systems. Formation flying is just staggering, as you will see from these video clips. Probably one of the most dangerous acts of all is the next one. This was 3 years ago I saw this. Knife edge pass, and the Red Arrows also do it in England, but there have been some remarkable accidents. It's a hugely dangerous maneuver. But it all began with these guys. And as you well know the story, there they are in their bowler hats, you know, and even were still wearing their ties as they operated in North Carolina on that amazing day, way back in 1903, where the first flight was made at Kitty Hawk, and that took a huge amount of effort to get those first initial machines to work. Anybody know how far the first flight went? Yep. Say again? Of that order, I thought it was a slightly more, but you may be right that the first flight was actually only 100 feet, 30 meters, which is basically not even the length of a Boeing 747. So you're actually, you know, it's a very short flight, but it was a controlled flight. Actually, others had flown, but they hadn't flown in a controlled way. I need to say this, particularly if there's somebody here from New Zealand, which is probably unlikely, but if I am lecturing or talking in the South, and I have done it in New Zealand, I was at pains to say that Richard Pearce did actually fly before the Wright brothers. But the difference is that Richard Pearce, although he did fly his flying machine, he wasn't really controlling it. The difference was that the Wright brothers, particularly Wilbur, but Orville also understood this, but I think Wilbur was really more the brains on this. He actually looked at the way the birds were flying, and he realized that you had to change the camber of the wings, and that was how the birds were controlling their movement. So his initial style of controlling the Wright Flyer, as it's now called, was actually by ropes which were twisting and changing the camber of the wings independently. So one wing might be changed differently to the other. And so he was able to cause a rolling motion. And of course he had a rudder, not at the back, unusually. Effectively, he had, well, no, he did have the rudder at the back, but the tail plane, which is the flat surface normally at the back, was at the front. But basically, you cannot do flying without a control system and without separate aerofoils, as we call them, both at the front or the middle and the back, or in his case, the front and the middle. So you always need two aerofoils in order to balance the plane, what we call longitudinally. That means in the direction at which you're flying. You also need mechanisms to roll the plane, okay, which these days we don't do it by changing the camber of the wing, well, not on every maneuver. We do it by what we call ailerons, which are pushed down one side, pushed up on the other. Next time you see an aircraft turning, if you're sitting in the right place, you can actually see them operating this. And it's a very complicated process. You cannot just do this by random effects. So flight is not simple, as this poor man found when he jumped to his death. It's not just a matter of growing feathers. And these guys were cheating when they used hot air balloons. So when we actually come to bird flight, and I meant to dig this out, I should have done. I forgot to bring it out to the front. But when you come to bird flight, the main issue, of course, is that birds have feathers. And a feather on its own is an amazing example of lightweight engineering. This is the flight feather of a buzzard. It's got a little bit worn over the years. I need to replace it with another one. But a feather has an amazing mechanism. But before I come to that mechanism, I need to point out that each feather has to be in the right place. It's no good just simply saying any old feathers will do. A feather has to be rightly curved such that it is, if it's a flight feather, asymmetric. That means that it's not symmetric around the stem, or we call this the rachis. That's the technical term for it. So you could tell immediately that this is a bit of a frayed flight feather. That is, it's the primary feather right on the edge of the wing. As you can see there, the green ones, or the green ones at the edge. Then you come in, there is secondary feathers. Then come in a bit further, there are tertiary feathers, and they're getting more and more symmetrical. The shape of the feather is what, of course, gives the planned shape of the overall wing. But it's not just the planned shape looking down. You've also got to get the effect of an aerofoil from end on. And the amazing thing about birds is that they form an aerofoil. Don't worry too much about the detail here. If I was doing a lecture as I do or have done in the past to students at Leeds, then I would be asking them, about things to do with the lift and how to work out the formula for lift. I'm not going to do that with you today. I might ask you to draw a diagram at the end, but I'm not going to actually do a test. But I used to lecture people on aerodynamics, particularly pilots, so that they understood what they were flying and how to understand the dangers when things go wrong, to know at least how your aeroplane works. Back to the point, though, on wings with birds, they are, of course, made of feathers. So looking at a wing end on, their feathers are actually positioned not only in the right position in a plan form, looking down on the wing, they're also positioned correctly in an looking end on, such that you've got a thicker effect at the front and a thinner effect at the back. To suggest then that wings could have been made by random effects of a reptile is frankly not understanding at all what aerodynamics is going on with birds. And many people have seriously suggested that reptiles gradually grew wings. And the whole notion cuts right across the understanding of the complication of making wings. You can see the effect that I'm talking about from this picture I took of a white-tailed eagle up in Scotland on the Isle of Mull. And you can see the effect of the leading edge, where you can see that I just need a pointer. I'm sorry, I forgot something else as well. I need to have my pointer, which is here somewhere. You can see at the leading edge that there is a very rounded effect there. Okay, can you see? Very rounded effect. That's very, very important for the eagle, in this case a white-tailed eagle, which is one of the biggest eagles. It's not the biggest of all, but it's getting on for a 7-foot or so wingspan. And you can see Also, I'll deal with the winglets eventually, but I just want you to see this amazing shape of the wing. Absolutely essential. And here's a white-tailed eagle in a turn, right? And as it's turning, one wing is operating differently to the other, and you can clearly see this effect of the leading edge. It's aerodynamic brilliance, to be frank, when you see an eagle flying, but it's also true of the smaller birds, although you can't quite see it so readily because they're flying so rapidly with their wings. You cannot appreciate the aerodynamics. We like the flight of an eagle because we can see it, because relatively speaking, it's slow. So to suggest that birds emerge from reptiles is frankly nonsense, because it's not grasping the principles of what's involved in flight. It's not just a matter of just spreading any old surface out, one side and the other. You've got to have a tail in the right place. And these surfaces are made, as we said, of feathers. When people suggest that the scale of a reptile is essentially the same as a feather, they are totally wrong. Because when in this biology book by a Japanese author called Fatuyama said the feather has the same fundamental structure as the development as a reptilian scale, he also was making a big mistake, because it's actually false. Not only is the scale not the same as a feather, it's coming from a different growth position than the feather. The structure is not the same, because the structure involves, and we'll come to where it grows in a moment, but the structure involves not only the barbs that you can see, but also barbules. If I separate these barbs, you can actually quite readily join them back together again. Now that is brilliant engineering, but it's at the micro scale. I'll do it again. You could get any old feather yourself, and you'll notice that you can separate it out. And if you look carefully, you can see that it's furry on the edge of each individual barb. And the issue is that the furriness on one barb is different to the furriness on the other side of the barb. What do I mean? Well, let me explain. The feather actually has a structure which only becomes evident when you look at it under the microscope. Here's the individual barbs that I mentioned, which are these black lines here, these very thick black lines, which we were separating out earlier. And coming from one side of the barb is a barbule with hooks. Coming from the other barb is a barbule with ridges. So that means the interlocking effect now comes from the barbules of adjacent barbs. Do you understand me? It's a little bit complicated to see. Maybe this will help you. You've got a barb here, right? So this is really blown up large. This is David Menton's picture from Answers in Genesis. He did this with a very large-scale microscope, large magnification. So you'll have one barb there. You'll have another barb here. And coming from one barb is ridges, which are these vertical ones here. And coming from the other barb are barbules with hooks. So the hooks slide over the ridges, which is why the barbs are connected together. Now, this itself is an argument for the fact that evolution hasn't got a hope of explaining this. Because in order to make just a feather, which is one of the most brilliant examples of engineering, and a lightweight example at that, an evolutionist has to argue that for some reason the barbules on one side of each barb are different to the barbules on the other side of the barb. And there is no rational reason for saying that that should come about by random mutations. There has to be a mind behind it. So even just a feather is enough to blow over any notion of evolutionary sophistry, which is really what's going on. It's not driven by science. It's driven by a desire to suppress the real evidence. The real evidence is saying this has been designed. But of course, it's not just a matter of having those feathers. You've got to have the feathers growing from a particular location in order for these mechanisms to then be seen. And the way a feather grows is from a sheath. And the sheath is a bit like this. If I bring this out from my, if I bring out another feather, right, then I can perhaps illustrate this point. And if I take a biro, right, and I put a feather in here, then you'll get the idea as to what's happening. The feather grows from a little holder, which is like a little cylinder, which is not coming from the same place as where the scale of a reptile comes. The tube, or the bottom of the tube, which is where the growth system is, comes from underneath the skin. It's a bit like a hair which grows from under the skin, right? It's not the same as a hair, but there is some similarity there. And it's nothing like a scale, right? It's coming from a different part, different layer of the skin. Then as the feather grows, it grows inside this rather fragile growth sheath. And as the feather grows, it then grows into position, and this sheath then crumbles away. It's a brilliant system for making sure that as each individual feather of the thousands of feathers that birds have, that they don't interfere with each other as they grow. So as a bird molts, it's molting with this system for every single feather. This gives you some idea as to how the feather grows in the sheath and then finally is placed in exactly the right location on the wing. You can see this on a wing of a pigeon, which we called Humpty because it fell out of a tree. And you can actually see the feathers growing out of these sheaths. And you can actually see just these bright tubes here are the bits of keratin sheath which eventually just crumble away. And it's an amazing system to see it in action. So feathers just on their own show to us that you cannot evolve this system. Let me now just come on to another aspect of flight, and that is that flight needs control. So not only do you need to have a surface, you must have a control system as well. The surface is made of feathers, but flight also needs a control system. You can have all the individual bits, but unless those bits are put together in the right order, it's not going to work. We call that principle irreducible complexity. The individual parts are not going to just suddenly organize themselves. There has to be a mind behind it in order to get the engines in the right place, to get the tailplane in the right place, to get the fin, which most aircraft have, although you can do without a fin. Most aircraft do have it. And birds actually operate without a fin because they have very sophisticated balancing mechanisms where they can twist the tail. We don't usually have twistable tails on our airliners. They might fall out of the sky if they did. So the Wright brothers actually understood this, and they actually changed the shape of their wings, as I said to you earlier. But eventually that was dumped as the best way to do things, and instead they had fixed wings, and then they had extra surfaces at the back, which we call flaps, or sometimes, depending what it's doing, if it's causing a roll of the aircraft, then it would be called an aileron. So that is the way that flight was done in the past. Today we have flaps, although this is not a very recent plane. This is a Lockheed TriStar coming into Montreal, and you can see the very complicated flap system which all aircraft use as they're coming in. Big airliners will use this. And it's very crude compared with the changing camber system which birds use. But it's absolutely essential to have a control system. That system is nowhere near as graceful as the system that you can see on a swan or any other bird, as it changes the camber without lots of screws being used, which is what we have to use in order to change the metal surfaces of planes. It's far more graceful as you see a bird actually with its muscle arrangement changing the camber of the wing as this swan is changing it in order to land onto the water. We got some marvelous examples here of birds. This is a friend of mine who took this picture of gannets, and gannets have automatic systems for changing the shape of their wings, such that they don't just sort of bring them in and just slightly alter the shape. They completely alter the shape of their wings, because these birds are diving birds. So they go up to a height, they go to a few hundred feet, and then they bring their wings in, and they go down like a pencil into the water. And this is a brilliant bit of footage. A friend of mine, Bob Buckley, took this up in Scotland, I think. And you can see this, particularly the one at the middle. You can actually see it's the same bird coming down like an arrow into the water. So there is a marvelous system in birds which is far more graceful for controlling flight. Other birds also have systems, but sometimes it's these seabirds which really show the finesse of these systems. They're all using changing camber on their wings, which is a much more efficient system than what we use in aircraft. We think that we've come of age because we can fly today, but we can't fly like the birds. Even though we may go faster than them, that's true, but birds are far more efficient in the movements in the air than we are. Just one other example of a surface which you may not be aware of in birds. There's more detail there than I'm going to comment on, but birds have an important system for at the front of the wing, and it's called an alula feather. And it comes roughly from the place where, because they have a similar skeleton to us, but they have elongated fingers which support the wing, and most of their wing is actually coming from the elbow here, okay? This part is actually very small on a bird, and most of the bird's wing is coming from the radius and the ulna here, and then an extended set hand which is supporting the outer surface of the wing. And the bit where the thumb is where these feathers are, which are called the alula feathers. Can be 3, 4, 5, or even 7 feathers, which support this alula. It's a little bit more evident here on this grey heron. You can see that's the alula feather. Now, it's basically a forward flap, and it makes sure that an aircraft has a forward flap, and the bird makes sure that the alula feather, which is just like this forward flap, it makes sure that the upper surface still has enough air going over it. And it's particularly important when it comes to landing. When you're at low speed, you're in danger of losing the lift on the top surface. So aircraft have actually forward flaps in order, the technical term is, if you're involved in aerodynamics, is to re-energize, to add energy to the upper surface of the wing, to stop it coming away from the top surface, which is what we call a stall, right? And birds don't just have that mechanism, they have yet another mechanism, which is not quite so obvious. I'll see whether I can just show you this, but I won't be able to show it easily, but I can just indicate where it is. If I show you this picture, which is actually mainly talking about winglets, but let me, before I come to that, let me just show you that at the back of the wing here, which I haven't got a clear picture of this, but at the back of the wing, the feathers are actually able, not actively, but passively, able to come up if the wing is beginning to lose lift. So what happens is that for birds, unlike rigid wings that we use in aircraft, as the air comes over the wing, if it's beginning to lose lift, right, a bird can actually stop that happening catastrophically by actually the air lifting the feathers, which means that it doesn't lose lift catastrophically. It actually happens more slowly. Whereas an aircraft, if it loses lift from the top surface, if you were in a Boeing 747, right, and it had a stall, you would literally just drop out of the sky. There would be no way of recovering a Boeing 747, even from 10,000 feet. You'd have to be at something like 20,000 feet if you were to have any chance of recovery, because the aircraft would have to go into a dive and then recover the lift over the upper surface, and that movement of such a huge tonnage of plane would take at least 20,000 feet to recover it. Whereas a bird can very readily recover from a stall. So there is pretty complicated aerodynamics going on in birds, much more sophisticated than people realize. And seeing as I'm on this picture, I'll just mention to you, the winglets are not there by accident. You'll have noticed that in the last, if you're a young person, you won't have realized that there was a change in airliners. But about 20 years ago, airliners started adding on winglets on the ends of the wings. That was no accident. They suddenly realized that the birds had something that they ought to use. And it is this, that the winglets are there to reduce what we call the vortex shedding, which always comes from a finite wing. It's called induced drag. You'll always get drag wherever you get lift, and you can never avoid it. And that drag is reduced if you actually have a winglet, because it breaks up this trailing vortex. And birds have this, and have had it for ever since they were created. And people hadn't realized it. Here's another example of a bird with these winglets, which is a kestrel at the end. Let me now come on to hovering birds, because these are the ones which are really getting dramatic, because it's very difficult for us to hover. You're breaking the rules when you actually have a helicopter. It's a very different aerodynamics. And by the way, helicopters are obviously sophisticated machines. There's only one other creature which looks like a helicopter, which I'll talk about tomorrow. But I'm just talking about birds flying, and they're what we learned from bird flight. And we nevertheless do have the ability, or birds do have the ability, some of them, to hover. This one is the European kestrel, which is a little bit more less colorful than the American kestrel, which is your kestrel here. This is a lot of brightly colored bird, but as you can see, you can see that it's spreading out its wings, but you don't see clearly the motion, which is what I want to show you on this picture, which is the hovering kestrel of the European kind. It's a bit more of a bland coloring, but you can see what's going on if you look at the, if you look at the end of the wings here, you can see that the wings are doing this. They're kicking the bird, right, and kicking it against the air. So the reason that is happening is because the kestrel is actually perfectly positioned, stationary, sometimes in a 30-mile-an-hour wind it can do it, right? And it's looking for voles and other creatures to feed on, right? It's got brilliant eyesight. But it's flicking its wings like this and balancing against its tail, right? And if the tail was not spread out, the bird would just flick over. So it's actually balancing longitudinally by flicking itself like that. And it's doing it without any problem whatsoever. Seeing a kestrel, which is not a very large bird, do that is a brilliant bit of stationary aerodynamics. It's not doing it by the helicopter system, which I'll talk about tomorrow. This is the normal flight system, but of course it's a moving wing doing this. But probably the one which really takes the biscuit is the hummingbird. These are some pictures I took only yesterday of at Barry's place, where he had one little emerald, brilliant emerald, and don't think it is a ruby-throated because it's got black, so it could be a black-chinned hummingbird. Somebody will have to correct me as regards identifying it. It could be a black-chinned hummingbird, but it's a beautifully colored iridescent green, and you can see here the motion of the wings, which is absolutely wonderful, and we were watching it last night as it came to feed. You see them all the time, but for us Europeans, they are a wonder to see. When people first saw them, they wrote back to Europe saying, these are amazing birds, and they didn't understand what they were doing. But now we, of course, do understand much more about how the hummingbird works. And it's hovering by a completely different principle to the kestrel. It's actually twisting its wing like this, such that if you look at the end of the wing, this is what the bottom picture is showing you, it's actually doing a figure-of-8 motion. And it's not actually moving its wing at the wrist at all. The wrist is almost rigid on a hummingbird, okay? And the motion is really coming from the elbow, which has a system in its skeleton enabling the radius and the ulna to twist right round like that, okay? So the hummingbird has to have a swivel system in order to do what it does. It's not like other birds in terms of its skeleton. It's different. It has the ability to twist its skeleton right over. And that's absolutely essential for the hummingbird to do this motion. But it's doing it so fast that it almost, you don't realize what you're seeing when you see it first of all. But when you take a video camera, you see the motion of what the wing is doing, but you have to have a camera taking a video image, something like 1,000 frames a second, in order to actually see the individual movement of the wing, which is doing this. So it's getting 2 beats for every time that it does this cycle, because it's doing a beat that way, or it's beating the air that way, as well as beating the air that way. And it's the difference in the way that it beats its wings from left to right. That is, the left wing might be doing slightly different motion to the right wing, which then causes a sideways movement. So you actually see hummingbirds go sideways, even backwards, and of course even upside down is quite easy for them to do because of this wing motion. Here's a blue-throated hummingbird taken with very, very fast photography, and you can see the motion of its wings, particularly this twisting back of the wing. Now it's doing this at roughly, on average, in normal flight, about 50 times to 60 times per second. When it's hovering near your feeders, it's going faster than that. It's getting up towards 100 times per second, because it's actually got to keep itself still. So it's got no forward motion at all, of course, when it's doing the hovering motion. And it has been known that in a dive, some male hummingbirds can get up to 200 times per second. That's about the fastest frequency known for hummingbirds. But that's not all. I could talk to you about the vortices and the way it controls all the vortices. By the way, you can get a DVD of hummingbirds called Refracted Glory. Go to, if you just put www.refractedglory.com, you'll find David Reeves and Benjamin Owen have produced a brilliant DVD which involves a number of us commenting on the wonder of hummingbird flight. But I'm not going to play that now. But what I want to just come to is this. Look at this tongue coming out. Now, the tongue of a hummingbird is a story in its own right, because the tongue is coming out at roughly 8 to 10 times per second, while the wings are beating at 40, 50, 60, right up to 100 times per second. So, but the tongue is not doing what people thought it was doing. They thought it was just like a straw sucking up the nectar, but no, it's not. Only recently has it become evident that the tongue is doing something extraordinary. I think we've just got enough time to play this video clip, which I want you to watch. It comes from the Discovery Institute.
The hummingbird's tongue is about twice as long as its beak, so it can reach deep into a flower. And until recently, many scientists believed that the birds relied heavily on capillary action to draw the nectar through their tongues and into their mouths. Kind of like water spontaneously rising up a thin straw in a glass. But some fascinating discoveries at the University of Connecticut have shown that the mechanisms involved are much more dynamic than anyone realized.
The hummingbird's tongue is actually a nectar trap equipped with a pair of narrow tubes that taper sharply. The tip of each tube is segmented into a row of flaps that are attached to a supporting rod. When the bird isn't eating, these flaps form 2 rows of closed loops that fit compactly into the beak. But when the hummingbird feeds, its tongue undergoes a dramatic transformation. Inside the flower, the tongue extends to make contact with the nectar. When immersed in fluid, the tip splits and the flaps on each fork systematically unfurl.
That evolved. I'm going to leave it there, but you can see it's just an amazing system. I'd encourage you to get that DVD called Simply Flight from the Discovery Institute. It's absolutely brilliant. Let me just briefly mention some other points, and that's this, that the bones and muscle structure of every bird, not just hummingbirds, is amazing. The bones for us are heavy. You've got heavy bones, and quite rightly so, because you are, and so am I, landlubbers. We are not designed for going into the air, in case you didn't realize. And the bird's bone structure is exceedingly light because it is meant to be going into the air. So it has a structure which is hollow. If you actually take out, next Thanksgiving, and you take out one of the bones and actually look at your turkey bone or your whatever bird it is, and you actually look at it closely, you'll see that it's hollow. It's made of struts similar to aircraft wings. When you've got birds which are diving birds, they actually can fly and they can take off from the water or from the land, but they struggle if they're taking off from without any help, that is diving from a cliff. This is a good illustration. When we were in Alaska, we saw these tufted puffins which were struggling to lift themselves up from the water. And I find this one rather amusing, as it's actually going like this across the water, and it can't take off very easily because it's got heavy bones. Eventually it did. And it's a pretty nifty mechanism which finally gets it off the water. But because it's really designed to be a diving bird. But most birds are not like that. They have hollow bones. It's just to say that there are some which do have solid bones. But not only that, there is a muscle arrangement which is very important for birds, and that is this. They have connected to their humerus bone, They don't just have one muscle like we do to bring the muscle down, to bring the bone down like that. We have that for actually moving in a motion for if you're going to hit somebody. I hope you haven't done that recently, but maybe you did. You know, you went like that with your arm. But we find it more difficult to lift our arm because although we do have a muscle at the back, it's quite weak. And so doing a backstroke in tennis, you have to develop that muscle. Whereas a bird doesn't have a problem at all because it has another muscle underneath the pectoralis major muscle, which is that muscle, right? It has another muscle which hooks round to the back of the humerus, and the ligament, when that shortens, then lifts the arm. You might try to do that now, except that you might clout the person next to you. But if you're going to try and do that motion, it's quite tiring, okay? But it's that motion that I'm talking about, the lifting of the wing. It's actually going that way, of course, for a bird, because I'm not a bird, I can't do this very well. But the bird is actually flying, obviously, like that, and it's trying to lift its wings, and it does it with ease because it has this extra muscle. In order to understand this, you might just watch this video clip to actually see it in operation. Here we are. Now, this extra muscle is called the supracoracoideus muscle, which lies underneath the pectoralis major muscle. So when that one shortens, it lifts the wing, and when the pectoralis major muscle operates, that of course brings the wing down. So you've got two muscles acting in tandem connected to the sternum bone, which is the breastbone. And the muscles are so organized such that most of the weight is underneath the bird, which keeps the bird stable in the air. Everything is there brilliantly put together for flight. Briefly, let me mention yet another aspect of birds, and that is that they breathe differently. They don't breathe with lungs like ours, which brings the air to a dead stop and then brings it into the blood. And then, of course, when we're breathing out, we take the carbon dioxide and it comes from the dead stop of the air with nitrogen primarily. Then the blood gives the carbon dioxide to that same air packet, mainly nitrogen, and then it's breathed out as carbon dioxide. So that's how we breathe. We breathe in and we breathe out. I hope that you're breathing in and out, because that, if you're not, you're dead. But we have to have that breathing system. Now, supposing reptiles changed into birds, then did you know that a bird breathes using an entirely different system? It breathes in once, and the air does not go through the lung. When it breathes in through the trachea, which is this air hole, just like we have, the air goes to the back of the bird into an air sac, called here a rear air sac. Then it breathes out, and it's breathing out an earlier packet of air, and this packet of air that we're following then goes through the lung, where the blood is coming in the other direction. If you're an engineer here, this is a counterflow mass exchanger, which is always known in engineering circles to be the most efficient system. And the blood is going in one direction and the air is going in the counter direction. So the air is giving off oxygen as the blood comes out, and the air is picking up carbon dioxide as the blood comes in. And the lung is full of parallel tubes, such that the bird is never stopping the air at all, because that would be an inefficient system. If you're up in the air, you don't want to have to bring the air to a stop. So everything's designed to actually keep the air flowing through the bird. In order to keep that system going, it must have a mechanism to cause the air to do that. How do we cause our air that we're breathing to go through into the lungs? Well, we have, in case you didn't realize it, a diaphragm, which goes down and up. And if it's going down and up, and even if you're asleep, it's still going down and up. Some of you might be going to sleep, but hopefully you're still breathing as the diaphragm does it without you realizing it. But did you know that a bird doesn't have a diaphragm? A bird doesn't have a diaphragm. Instead, it uses its sternum bone, the breastbone, to push out and to push in again. So if you were going to go from a reptile to a bird, there would have to be a transition where the poor creature wouldn't be able to breathe, in which case evolution wouldn't work, because you'd be having to say that you got to survive as some transitional creature which is basically dead because it can't breathe. So this idea that reptiles have actually changed into birds falls foul of the breathing mechanisms, which are different in birds than in reptiles. However, some people will say, well, it's been shown that alligators do have a counterflow breathing system. But what they don't have is a mechanism. In order to be like a bird, you would have to be saying that some reptile was actually moving its breastbone in and out and losing a diaphragm. You'll find that all alligators and all reptiles have a diaphragm. So it's not answered by that point when people say that it could be that alligators have a counterflow system of a lung structure. That's actually not been proven that all alligators do that, or all reptiles could have done that. The problem still remains that a bird doesn't have a diaphragm and moves its sternum bone. Let me just mention something further. In moving its breastbone, it's then going to have a problem with its ribs. Did you know that a bird has movable and bendable but hinged ribs? There is actually a hinge in the ribs in order to avoid the ribs breaking every time it moves its breastbone in and out. One of the other things, of course, is that birds migrate. Why do birds fly south in winter? Do you know? Because it's too far to walk, somebody said. But birds fly some huge distances. The Arctic tern flies from one pole to the other. When it's getting cold in the north, it flies to the south. When it's getting cold in the south, it flies back up to the North Pole. So it migrates between the North and South Pole each year, a distance of 12,000 miles. We were talking earlier to Heinz and Gerda and myself and Juliet about the fact that some people often, and they have done it, have gone on holiday in Hawaii. Did you know that the Pacific golden plover doesn't go on holiday, but it migrates between northern Canada, Alaska, and even some of these parts, I believe, to Hawaii, a distance of 3,000 miles. But get this, the adults go first and leave the young ones to fly on their own, having never made the journey before. Even for the adults flying across the ocean non-stop, they've got to make sure that they've eaten enough, but not too much, like some of us. You know, you might just go plop into the ocean if you did that. But if you don't eat enough, you also might go plop into the ocean because you haven't got enough energy, you haven't got enough fuel in order to get there. Every pilot knows in order to make a journey, he must have just the right amount of fuel. And he must work out the calculation as to how he's going to get to his destination. Otherwise, he's going to become a cropper and fall into the ocean. But the young ones haven't even been trained. How do they know how much to eat? How do they know where Hawaii is? How do they understand the mapping system? Well, we're beginning to understand that birds seem to have a magnetite in their brains, which may sense the magnetic field of the Earth, but it still remains a problem as to how do they know where Hawaii is on the map. Nobody's yet worked that one out. Even if we do work it out, it shows brilliant, sophisticated systems are at work in order to ensure that the young ones make the journey. Perhaps the one which takes the biscuit, or takes the cookie, you would say, because you speak funny over here. But is the bar-tailed godwit, which makes the journey 7,700 miles non-stop from Alaska to New Zealand. That is a phenomenal journey. And it flies non-stop for 6 days. It was verified by tagging the bird. And it was verified in 13 years ago that it had come all the way from Alaska right across the Pacific to New Zealand. Well, I talked about the Blue Angels earlier. Let me just end with this. Did you know that some birds have an amazing formation flying system? And it's just the ordinary, common European starling. When you see starlings in Europe, some of us, I don't know whether you have starlings over here. I don't think you do. Maybe you do. Okay. All right, you do. All right. Okay, all right. Don't get excited. All right. I'm not accusing you of anything just because you have or you don't have starlings. So, but starlings are amazing birds. They're quite small, as you know. They're not bigger than about a foot, maybe less than that, 8 or 9 inches, average size. But sometimes they gather together, not just in their hundreds, not just in their thousands, but in their hundreds of thousands. And it's called murmurations. Heinz Slick-Lama comes from the area where originally his family came from, Holland, and this video is taken from Holland. And it happens in England as well. You just suddenly see it taking place, usually in the fall, as it's beginning to get colder and the birds are thinking of moving on. And this is what happens. We're beginning to understand murmurations. Each bird is simply following its neighbor and aware of its neighbor. But in the process, there is a whole gathering of all the birds making one shape and all lingering together. Nobody quite knows, though, who is instigating the initial movement. And nobody's quite worked that out. We have worked out how the birds are operating one with the other, but nobody's quite yet understood how it's decided where they go next. But it's an amazing sight when you see it. And it does just show us that there are wonders still to be understood in the flying world. God said to Job, "Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and stretch her wings towards the south?" You also said in Job chapter 40, "Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like him? Deck yourself now with majesty and excellency and array yourself with glory and beauty." When were birds made? Well, according to the Bible, they were made on day 5 with the fish and, of course, the flying creatures. Everything strongly shows that birds are designed. Why? Well, the technical term is irreducible complexity. Nothing will work unless everything works together. Right? It's not just, as I said earlier, not just a matter of having 2 wings. You've got to have a tailplane as well. You've got to have a control system. Everything has got to operate in sympathy together. And may I say, everything shows that it really is a mind behind this, which has enabled birds to do what they do and to bring glory to the Creator, which of course is the Lord himself. Though I love to talk about creation, may I say that I'm even more concerned that people should see that the Bible primarily is not even talking about creation. It's primarily talking about redemption. But so many people are blocked to understanding that Christ is the Savior because they haven't yet understood that God, and Christ in particular, is the Creator. Brilliant engineering by a brilliant engineer And I would say that everything testifies to the greatness of what the Lord has done in making birds which are to his glory. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Andy. That was brilliant.
Thank you,
But
Heinz.
a lot of information he covered there, and I'm sure there's going to be a few questions about what he all talked about. And while you're thinking of the question, I just want to remind you that the way we support this ministry is through free will offerings. So if you would like to help contribute to support this ministry, the men will be along in a few minutes, and you can contribute that way. And if you feel you'd like to contribute through the donation boxes in the back, that's fine later as well. So if you have a question, put up your hand. I'll bring the mic around so we can all hear it. Questions about flight? Yeah.
What do you think about the Archaeopteryx, if I'm pronouncing it correctly?
Yeah, I didn't actually put up the picture, but I do have it here of the Archaeopteryx. Thank you so much for asking that question, young man. I appreciate your mentioning it. Archaeopteryx and other birds I will comment on at this point have been found which have different characteristics, says Archaeopteryx, to birds today. So we don't deny the facts that when we actually look at Archaeopteryx, shown here on the right, it has teeth in its jaw. It also has a bony tail, and birds today don't have that. Does that mean it wasn't a bird? No, not necessarily. It simply means that in the past there were birds which had far greater variety than the enormous variety that we still have in birds today. In other words, the enormous variety we now have was even greater in the past. What I would suggest is that from a biblical point of view, what's happened is that some birds didn't survive very well in the New World. Maybe they were taken by predators, who knows, right? But Archaeopteryx would have gone onto the ark, just like all the other birds. It would have come off the ark, like all the other birds, but hasn't survived up to the present day. We've lost other birds. We've lost the dodo. We've lost the American pigeon, because basically human beings were shooting them, right? But there are many reasons why we've lost the greater variety of birds that there was in the past. And Archaeopteryx is just simply one of those birds that has been lost by natural causes. Thank you. By the way, there are other examples of birds which have been found, which we don't have today, particularly in the Liaoning shales in China. Okay, there's a lot of creatures. Some of them actually aren't birds. They're claimed to be birds. They've got furriness on their scales, and they think, oh, you know, these are birds, but they probably aren't. But there are some which clearly are birds. One of them is the Caudipteryx, which clearly is a bird, but it's not a bird we have today. Thank you for that question. That was very thoughtful.
Yeah.
So my understanding of the lung system of the bird, from reading other articles, says that the air moves in one direction through the lung, and the blood moves in the opposite direction.
Yep.
But that the air never returns in its path. When we breathe in and we breathe out, but the birds breathe in, and then that, when it comes in, it goes out through a different system.
No, that's not. You made a mistake at that last point. Let me explain. The air goes in, right? And maybe I didn't complete it when I said it earlier, so apologies if I didn't. The air is breathed in, goes to the rear air sac. Then, as the bird breathes out, it's breathing out an earlier packet of air, and the air that we're following now goes through the lung, according to the system that I mentioned earlier. right? Now, so as the air is going through the lung here, this packet of air goes, as the air goes through the lung that we're following, does that, if that's my left hand, and another packet of air is actually coming out. Now it breathes in again, right, and another packet of air goes to the back, right? This packet of air that we're following now goes to a front air sac, right? Now it breathes out a second time, and this packet of air comes out. So it's a circulatory breathing system, right? Which is kept going by the sternum breastbone going in and out like a bellows, okay? So it's constantly going round the system like that. And of course, with the hollow bones of the rest of the bird, it can store air, which is particularly important if it's actually doing a very fast movement like a peregrine falcon, and it can't breathe on the way down, but the air is still going from the air sacs and the hollow bones through the lung. Sorry if that was not clear in the talk. I think I didn't complete the cycle. I think I made that mistake. Feel free to ask any more questions. We learn a lot by questions.
Hi, I was wondering, why do they think that the reptiles turned into birds? How can they think that?
Well, what they're trying to say is that something like a velociraptor reptile, which is a little dinosaur, right, was trying to struggle to actually get insects, and it grew these addendum on its arms, and scales, which were just lots of little bits of scale coming out of its arms, which would be able to gather the insects better, and then these became feathers, and by jumping into the air, it was able to actually get more insects and more stuff that it wanted to feed on. It's just a story. It's just in the imagination of people. Because what they're trying to do is to not accept that birds are actually a different type of creature to reptiles. Because, as I've said, the bone structure is different. A feather in its own right is totally different to a scale. And why are they doing it? Because they don't want to believe in the obvious that birds are a different creature and are created by a mind behind them. And the evidence, of course, is that there is no clear progression from a reptile to a bird. There are some similarities. They've got technically a pentadactyl structure. That means that 5 fingers are coming out in the hand, but that's just an argument from similarity. From morphology, you cannot prove that there is a progression of life. Just simply saying that apes have a similar structure superficially to a human being doesn't prove that we're related. And of course we're not. So why are they doing it? Because they don't want to believe in the entirely consistent position, which is that birds are different to reptiles. Birds are different to mammals as well. So I hope that helps. It's very difficult to understand sometimes the mind behind what is an evolutionary thinking, but basically it's because they don't want to have God in their thinking.
Birds flying at several thousand feet in the air, how come they don't pass out from the lack of oxygen?
Thank you. Some birds do fly exceedingly high up, but there is a limit. They won't be able to fly more than about, it's usually in the region of 7,000, that sort of height. You'd struggle to find any, there may be odd examples where a bird has gone momentarily higher to get over a mountain range, but it's usually not, certainly won't be more than 10,000. Okay, most birds won't be flying higher than about 7,000 or 8,000. And to be frank, it's similar for us. If you were to go higher than 10,000 feet, you would struggle to breathe without help. Going up Everest, you've got to have a breathing system, help from carrying oxygen in order to get to the top. So birds do have a limit.
Are there questions you have?
The young man wants to ask another one.
Yeah.
Have you heard about them finding ducks and things like that with dinosaurs?
Could you repeat that first bit?
Oh.
Finding what?
Yeah, modern birds like ducks and owls, actually, flamingos, that sort of stuff, with dinosaurs and fossils.
I haven't heard that they found them in the same layers as dinosaurs, so you can tell me afterwards if in fact that is indeed the case. I've known that dinosaurs have been found with mammals, and indeed a mammal has been found with a dinosaur in its stomach, right? I know that's happened, but I haven't known about ducks definitely being found in the same layers. I do know this example, which is supposed to be a 99 million year old hardened resin, so it's amber, right? And in it was a baby chick, right? And the baby chick is, of course, no different, really, when you consider it, to a modern bird, right? And so that immediately is telling you that birds haven't evolved, because this chick looks exactly the same as a modern chick. It's not been proven exactly what that bird is, but it certainly doesn't show any resemblance to an evolutionary process. So it's maybe something like that, maybe further down in the layers, because you're presumably talking about Cretaceous rock, which traditionally would be, well, it could be Cretaceous at 99 million in the traditional evolutionary scale. So it's possible that you're referring to cases like that, but I'll talk to you afterwards about that.
Okay, I think we'll bring this to a close now, and Andy will be available to answer more questions at the table. And let's thank him for his presentation. And if we could show the last slide in our presentation here. This is the talk we're going to have next month. Okay, and that will be by J.D. Mitchell, who has been here a number of times before to speak. He's from the Portland area. And I want to thank the young man there for introducing the topic. That is, he's going to talk about living fossils. That's exactly what Andy was referring to there. Fossils that should be old, and the living example of that fossil still looks the same. That's what we call a living fossil. So if we can get that slide up there, that's what the talk is going to be about. He'll explain what we mean by a living fossil, and and he'll give quite a few examples of that, and the result will show us that the fossils, or that the living creatures we have today, the fossils thereof, a number of layers down, they're almost exactly the same. There has been no evolution, no change that is evident in that. That's what that talk will be about. J.D. Mitchell, he's a retired engineer, and he's written a number of books on creation. He's studied these issues for a long time, and so we're going to be privileged to have him here next month, and that'll be October the 26th. So I want to remind you that there's flyers in the back tables there. There's books, a number of book tables there you want to take a look at, and remember those two free, one booklet and the free DVD that's also on our book table there, so feel free to take some of those. There is also a book table to the very right that is marked 50% off. Those are specially reduced books that we have available. And McIntosh has his book table there in the middle of the room, and so he's got some very special things there. And he mentioned those three books. and they are available on his table there as well. I want to remind you that he's going to be back tomorrow morning to do that mini conference, and he will continue some of the things he talked about before. These are basically the wonders of design found in nature. And when he talks about the design in birds and other animals, it's interesting that we as humans are trying to imitate the design there to make our airplanes more efficient and boats and all these things more efficient through the design we see in nature. So the two topics, the wonder of insect flight and the wonder of hearing, will be here tomorrow morning from 9 till noon, and we'll end that with about a half hour of open Q&A, other questions that you may have about creation and evolution. So, and then Saturday night, for those of you youth that are interested in youth night, there's a flyer on the back table which explains that at 6 o'clock at Lake Stevens Calvary Chapel. And I guess all this information is on our website as well. So with that, let me bring it to a close, a word of prayer, and then be dismissed to look at the resource tables, and there are refreshments in the back as well. Father, we thank you for the time we've had here with Andy, for the knowledge you've given him and his engineering and science studies, and how that relates to creation and your word. And we thank you for that knowledge that you've given to him so that he can impart that to us and that we in turn can share with others. We thank you for the evidence that you have given us in your creation for your existence. Bless now the time around the tables and the refreshments, and we pray for safe travel back home. In Jesus' name we pray. Just one last word. I just again want to mention that Emil, who Andy pointed out. Emil, stand up for a second. He is from Bulgaria. He's a missionary. He's a native Bulgarian. Andy has spoken at a church a few times. I've spoken at his church a number of times as well. Gerda and I go to Bulgaria on mission trips, and he's one of the missionaries from that area. He works with Campus Crusade, a very effective university ministry. So if you have a minute, just feel free to talk to Emil as well. You're dismissed.